This week on Oasis by the Sea, Pastor Keith teaches Hezekiah from Isaiah 36 and 37.
There's a word that I heard probably for the first time when I was maybe, 12, 13. The word was bipolar. Don't worry, this isn't going to be a sermon about psychology. But I heard this word bipolar, and I learned what it meant. It meant somebody who just they're really, really high or they're really, really low all the time. If you can imagine the planet, it has the North Pole, South Pole. It's like you can be at the north, you can be at the south, but never in between. You're like wham, wham, wham. We've been studying Isaiah, and Isaiah feels a little bipolar. It's prophecies, and they're prophecies about doom and gloom, and it's going to be bad. Glorious, mercy, yay, fantastic. It slams back and forth constantly between these two extremes. And I know I'm making a little bit of fun. But the reason it's like that is because reality is a bit like that. The reality is that our mess that Jesus needed to fix, that we talked about at communion, is really, really bad. And the gift of God and grace is really fantastically good. The truth is that life is pretty extreme. We dumb it down, we make it simple, but at its heart, there's an extremeness to life. But it's been a constant whiplash. And it's kind of nice, what we're going to get to today, it feels a little bit less whiplashy. We've been talking about some stuff that we have no control over at all. Things that have happened in the past, obviously we have no control over that, and things that will happen in the future that God is going to make happen, whether we want it to happen or not, or whether we help or not, it's going to happen. It can be exhausting. And we've been studying Isaiah, we've ridden this roller coaster, and now what I'm doing is I'm finishing up with a series of a few key passages that are unique enough to warrant special attention. And one of those places is in chapters 36 and 37 of Isaiah. And here in the middle of all this prophecy about things, there's a very much real, very, very real person. Hezekiah, a very, very real person with a very, very real problem who did a very, very real thing and witnessed a very, very real victory. We have a concrete, tangible history buried here in the middle of all this prophecy. There's this history in the middle. The reason it's in there is because Isaiah plays a major part of this, and so it's part of Isaiah's story. So in this book of prophecy, we have a little bit of history. Before we go any further, let me kind of introduce us to this guy Hezekiah first, so we understand what's going on. Hezekiah is a remarkable person from Jewish history. He became king at 25 years old. He was king of Judah. If you don't know much about biblical history, at some point God's people had a civil war and they split in half, and Israel had been the north half and Judah had been the bottom. Half is probably the wrong word. Much more of it was Israel than Judah. Judah was in the south. But at this point in history, when Hezekiah comes along, that northern country of Israel has been completely demolished by a nation called Assyria, really an empire, Assyria. They're gone. In fact, they're gone. They're going to be taken into captivity. They don't come back. They're over. Their story is over. Israel's history, as far as separate from Judah, just finished. They've been dragged away into captivity, never to be heard from again. Hezekiah is the first king since Solomon, who's the only king of God's people. This hasn't happened in a very long time. For a very long time, there's been a king of the north and a king of the south. Now there is no north. And so now Hezekiah is the king of God's people. 2 Kings 18:5 says that of the kings of Judah, he was the best one, that no king before him or after him would be a better king of Judah than he was. Please remember that King David was a king of all 12 tribes, king of Israel. Hezekiah is not being compared to David, but to the other kings of Judah, the 2.5 tribes that split off and lived in the south. Maybe you don't know this, but Jerusalem, the capital that David had built, was in Judah. And so Jerusalem is still standing, and that's where Hezekiah reigns from. And it would take an entire sermon to describe every good reform that Hezekiah did as king, so I'm not going to. This is only one sermon. Yeah, but it is fantastic reading. To read more about King Hezekiah, and I highly encourage it, 2 Kings 18, 19, and 20, 2 Chronicles 29, 30, and 31. And the event that happens here in Isaiah is so important that it's recorded 3 times in the Bible. Once here in Isaiah, also in Kings and in Chronicles. There's not many events in the Bible that are recorded that many times. So this is a very, very important thing that happens. And so our key detail number 1, King Hezekiah is now the only king of God's people. He's a fantastic king. He's changed a great deal of stuff for the better. But key detail number 2 is Assyria is crouched at their door. This is a map. I realize that from where you're sitting in the back, it's kind of just a big green blob. So I get that. So the Mediterranean Sea is over there on the left. The Red Sea kind of splitting down there. Egypt would be to the left of the Red Sea. The big green blob is how big Assyria is going to get. When our story happens, we're not quite to that size yet. Jerusalem is a red dot really close to the Mediterranean Sea where the green parts gets really skinny. The capital of Assyria is in the dark green spot. You might know the word Nineveh. The capital of Assyria is Nineveh. In fact, 70 years before Hezekiah becomes king, Jonah is over there prophesying and Nineveh repents. That was only 70 years before this all happens. Trying to give you some context of other things that happened in the Bible, what's going on, what's happening here. The king of Assyria is a man named Sennacherib. Historians say that Assyria had amassed the largest army the world had yet seen, 200,000 soldiers. Historically speaking, we don't have a record of anything larger than that up until that point. So this is so far. This is the largest military superpower of all time. There's 2 major rivals to Assyrian world dominance, Greece and Egypt. Greece is in some islands. It would require boats. That's a little more complex. Egypt is accessible by land. At some point, a massive portion of those 200,000 soldiers were sent toward Egypt in the hopes of absorbing or defeating that other superpower. And that's why there's this green line that goes all the way from where it starts, all the way down to where Egypt is, because that was the mission. It was to take Egypt. And we're partway through that story. An archaeologist named Stephen Compton used aerial photography to find the exact locations where this massive army camped. So because it was so big, and because they always camped in the same shape, he was able to use photography and actually track. They stopped in this place in the world and they camped because it indented the earth. And then it went here, and he could actually track where this army went. This is historical fact. It's amazing. And this is where the historical record and the biblical record in Isaiah 36 intersect. This massive army has demolished Israel to the north. Judah is next on the menu in their journey southward toward Egypt. Now I want to interrupt at this point to tell you the end of the story. The end of the story is God wins. You probably already knew that. But that's the end. Be encouraged, be reminded of God's power. This entire event is to remind us and help us understand how mighty God is. The miracle in this event deserves a movie. But there are some lessons in the midst of this. Lessons about what to do in a crisis, lessons about understanding God's response, lessons about waiting on the Lord. So we need to be looking for those lessons as we go. The end of the story is God wins, and that's the main point. But on the way, there's some things that happen that can teach us some things. For the sake of time, I'm not going to cover every word out of these 2 chapters. We're just going to hit the highlights. So let's start with Isaiah 36:1. Now it came about in the 14th year of King Hezekiah. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. What does that mean? Does that mean that they already lost? That can be confusing. He seized all the fortified cities in Judah. So does that mean all of Judah is, what does that mean? So has anyone played the game Risk? Maybe a few of you? Okay. So this is a game I play. If you haven't played Risk, it's this world domination game, right? So in the game of Risk, you will typically have a whole bunch of area that is very lightly fortified. But on the edge, you're like, all your armies are stacked right there on the edge, right? Because you got to keep them out. This is reality. This isn't just a game. When you have in these ancient countries, right? The edge of the country, you put more soldiers there. Because if somebody was going to come in, you wanted them to have to go through that edge. Jerusalem was toward the north part of Judah. And what this means is the Assyrian army had just come and rolled over those fortified cities. That edge of Risk. They just kind of went, they just crushed them. They came right in. They were gone. So the fortified cities means that those northern cities that were extra beefed up to try to keep an army from doing exactly what they just did, they just mowed them over. And that's how this begins. So now Judah is naked from the northern border to the capital, which is Jerusalem. And the army ends up camping about 5 kilometers north of Jerusalem and stops. And this was their mode all the way through. They would get to the major city, the capital. They'd stop about 5 kilometers away. They'd make their big circular thing that we today can continue to track. So that means that the country, that's about 80%, that was south of Jerusalem was still relatively functioning, and those people hadn't been attacked. It doesn't mean that there aren't unprotected towns that are getting harassed by traveling soldiers and that sort of thing, but the territory of the south is not actually being held by the Assyrian army yet. But instead of instantly sacking the city, King Sennacherib sends a letter to King Hezekiah demanding his surrender. There's some political stuff going on here behind the scenes. In 2 Kings, we read that Hezekiah actually ravaged the temple of silver in an attempt to pay Sennacherib off and meet his demands. All he ended up doing was losing a bunch of silver. Before Israel fell, they attempted to ally with Egypt to defend themselves, and that didn't work either. But I want to skip to the good part, or perhaps the bad part, depending on your perspective. Sennacherib's messenger has delivered a letter and is now speaking in Hebrew to those who surround him. We're going to skip to Isaiah 36, 14 through 18. This is the spoken message, a speech to the Hebrews, the Jews, after he's delivered the official letter to be delivered to the king. Thus says the king, "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us. The city shall not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. For thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me, and come out to me, and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree, and drink of the water of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Beware, lest Hezekiah misleads you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria?" He keeps going, but you get the idea. He is directly challenging and saying, look, nobody else's God helped them. Your God isn't going to do any better. Give up. We're going to talk about later why they want him to give up rather than fight. There's a reason for that. But this is the challenge. The estimated population of Judah right now is 110,000 people. This army that's assembled just north of the country, the army itself has more soldiers than the entire country has men, women, and children combined. This isn't a contest. This is a massacre. This is ludicrous. This is an army bigger than your country at your doorstep. And he says, give up, which sounds pretty reasonable in these circumstances. Just hang out, do your thing, drink of your own wine, raise your own stuff. We'll come get you when we're ready, and we'll take you to another place. You'll be able to grow food there, don't worry. You'll just be doing it for us. That's the deal. On a natural level, this is not a contest. Nobody else's God was able to save them. You will be no different. Quit trying, give up. If God could save people, he would have done it before, but he can't, and you're doomed. Do you ever fight that feeling? Does that feeling that what I'm up against is too big, God can't help me? Have you ever had that feeling? I'm not asking you whether you think it's true in your head. I'm talking about whether you've felt it inside. I have. I felt doomed before. I can't say I like it. In fact, I could in great detail tell you the story of every single time I felt completely overmatched. And there's been quite a few. I have felt hopeless. I have felt as if there was nothing I could do. I have felt doomed. And in my soul, there was doubt. I have felt doubt. My brain told me God is big enough, but I'm telling you, I have felt at times that God wasn't. I have. I'd be lying if I told you that that feeling had never happened to me. And yet, as I look at this situation that Hezekiah is in, I would have to tell you, I have never been in a situation as dire as what's described here. I mean, imagine being King Hezekiah. Imagine the burden of 110,000 lives. Imagine your fortified cities getting rolled over effortlessly. Imagine staring at an army larger than your entire country in size. I don't care who you are, how much faith we think we have. This is nightmare level. This is nightmare. Let's look carefully at what this king, the greatest king of Judah of all time, does. This is Isaiah 37, 14 and 15. Then Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And he went up to the house of the Lord, and he spread it out before the Lord, and Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. We could simply say that Hezekiah's response was to pray. That would be oversimplifying his response. In the face of this threat, Hezekiah doesn't go talk with his military leaders. He doesn't go to his legal counsel team. He doesn't go to those who managed goods to see how long their supplies might last. He goes to the temple. His complete attention goes to God. He goes to God and he lays out his troubles physically on the ground before God. He brings his case to the Lord. I'm going to tell you why. Because this was already the man he was. You know, sometimes we think we can just live however we want to live, and then if the crisis comes, we'll just kind of kick up the religiousness enough to handle it, and then maybe we can go back to normal. That doesn't work very well. The reason King Hezekiah responded in this incredibly godly way is because he had already been on the path of responding to things in a very godly way. That's why he's there. This wasn't his last-ditch attempt. Yeah, how many times is God our last attempt? How many times have we tried this, we tried that, and then finally we go, well, I guess I could pray. As if that was the worst possible way for this to get fixed. As if, oh, well, I guess if I have to let God do something really cool, that's the way it has to go. I'll do that. As silly as this may sound, this may be one of the most beautiful scriptures in all of Scripture to me. This picture of Hezekiah, I can just imagine the tears falling from his face and the stress and the burden of imagining this threat. And he takes these threats in the house of God and he kneels on the ground and he spreads them out. And he lifts his hands. He says, God, what am I going to do? How much more successful would our lives be if this was our immediate response when things came that were just too big? And we just bring them to the house of the Lord and lay them on the floor and lift our hands to the Father and go, God, I do not know what to do. I need you so bad. What an inconceivably huge threat. What a simple and beautiful response. Last week we looked at the dangers of pride. Today we're going to witness the power of humility. This is what is written here between the words. The king on his knees, weeping for his people. the threats laid on the floor, a man who is all too aware that he has nothing of value to add to the situation. I want to boldly tell you right now, every human being who has done this before the one true God has been met with grace. Every single one. Every single time. And this prayer that Hezekiah prays describes, it deserves its own sermon, and I don't have time to do another sermon. You should read it. It's powerful. I think I will preach it another day. And in this response of Hezekiah, God sends Isaiah to deliver his promise. The first part is poetic. It's full of just wonderful wording, and it's deserving of its own sermon again all by itself. And then we get to the practical, very real, very concrete instructions from God. This is Isaiah 37, 30 and 31. Then this shall be a sign for you. You shall eat this year what grows of itself. In the second year, what springs from the same. And in the third year, sow, reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. And the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. What in the world does that mean? Here's the instructions. And to understand them, you have to understand a little bit about war and how things worked back then. But here it is. If the people planted food on the farms, here's what was going to happen. They would raise the food, but this massive army of so many people, they would come down and just take it. If they planted food and raised it, it was going to feed the enemy. There was no way for Jerusalem's army within the walls of the city to come out and defend them. They'd just get squished. They only had some sort of security inside the walls. And so God said, you're going to actually just eat whatever happens to grow. It's going to be really thin. You're going to be hungry. You're going to be really hungry. But you're not going to plant. Because if you plant, it's just going to be taken 2 years. That's going to happen. For 2 years, you don't plant anything, because if you do, the enemy's just going to take it. You live off whatever you can scavenge from the ground. But in the third year, plant. And by the time there's a harvest, you'll get to eat it. And he doesn't say how. He doesn't say what's going to happen. He just says, if you plant in the third year, you will get to eat your own food. The enemy won't come and take it. You'll get to eat. But you're going to have to not eat very well at all for 2 whole years. It was going to be a rough 2 years. In other words, God told them how long they had to hold out. And you may be wondering why the Assyrian army just didn't simply attack the city. Surely with such a numerical advantage, they would have won. And you are absolutely correct, they would have squished them. They would have won. Here's the problem. I don't know if you know anything about ancient warfare, but defenders in a city had a massive advantage on those who were attacking, regardless of how big the attacking army was. And it was pretty normal for the ratio of defenders to attackers to be about 1 to 4. So if there's one defender, they can kill 4 attackers before they die. That's about roughly what you get to do if you have walls. Because there's only, even if you have this massive army, there's only so many that can get to the wall at the same time. There's just space. And here's the problem. They've got to get this army all the way to Egypt and still have enough army to win. So let's say Jerusalem could manage to pull together 10,000 soldiers. That could mean losses up to 40,000 for the coming army. That's not insignificant. And if this happened every time they came to a walled city, they wouldn't have any army left by the time they got to Egypt. And so they didn't really want to. So they're in a standoff. Judah is in Jerusalem, and if they leave the walls, they're just going to get squished, so they can't leave. But this big fat army, even though they could just roll over them, really doesn't want to take 40,000 in losses. So what they want to do is for these people to give up. And the primary way they would go after this was starvation. They tried to starve out the country. That's the primary thing. Not because they had to. They could have won by force, but you just don't want your guys to die. You want them to still be alive by the time you get to your destination. So they're going to try and starve them out. And that's why we have this 2 years, even though the army clearly would have won. You're like, why? Why wait? Well, Jerusalem's just one walled city. If this happened over and over and over again, there'd be no army left by the time they got to Egypt. So here they are for 2 years waiting. Sometimes God says, wait. I do not like waiting. And I'm going to tell you what really, as a human being, bothers me about this story. God's going to do something really, really, really great. Okay? Why didn't he do it right away? Why didn't he immediately do the really cool thing? It isn't like Hezekiah hasn't done the right thing. Hezekiah came, and he did the right thing, and he gave it all to God. He says, God, do whatever you want. It was really, really beautiful. And why didn't God just go, bam, it's fixed? He could have gone, bam, it's fixed. But he didn't. He said, no, I'm going to have you wait 2 years. And it wasn't a nice 2 years. It was a hungry 2 years. It was a barely scraping by 2 years. It's 2 years of the pressure. Can you imagine living 2 years in a city where there's an army bigger than, like so much bigger than your city, right out there? The stress. We think we have emotional problems because of the stress we have. Remember COVID, and we all thought we were under stress? Ha! Nothing compared to this. This is massive. God says, I want you to deal with it for 2 years. 2 years of hunger, 2 years of feeling trapped, 2 years of enduring mockery and fear and tension. But you know what? 2 years of faith. 2 years of faith. I get impatient if God demands my faith for a month. This is a threat any larger than any of us have ever faced. Cancer is ugly. I'm not downplaying it, and it's horrible. It kills one person at a time. This army is going to kill 110,000 at a shot. I'm not trying to downplay. I'm just saying this isn't anything like any of us deal with. This is a threat to an entire ethnic group. This is potential genocide. And God makes them wait for 2+ years. There's a mystery I do not understand. There's a mystery I cannot explain to you. There is a heavenly calculus when it comes to faith that I cannot explain. But Jesus referenced it many times. He said, your faith has made you well, or he would comment on the greatness of someone's faith. Jesus measured faith. He compared people in faith. He said, you have a lot and you have a little. It wasn't just an on-off switch. There was a quantity of faith that Jesus would comment on. And there's a quantity of faith that happens in my life. And I don't always have the same amount of faith. It isn't a yes-no question. There are levels. God stores up 2+ years of faith from an entire nation. That's what he stores up. He stores up the faith and the belief and the trust of an entire nation for 2 years. And then this is what he does with that moment. This is Isaiah 37:36. Then the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the men arose early the next morning, behold, all these were dead. In a night. Remember that archaeologist I told you about, Stephen Compton, who tracked all those places this army camped? You know where the last camp is? 5 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Didn't ever go any further than that. That was the end. That was the last one. I want you to get the full visual impact of what happened. Exmouth has 3,000-ish people. And granted, we're not packed in quite as tightly as tents would be, but just imagine, I'm trying to get you to imagine, how much space would the tents require to house 185,000 soldiers? What is the geographical area we're talking about? I mean, it would be tents as far as you can see in any direction. Don't just read these big numbers in the Bible and go, that seems like a big number, and go to the next page. Look, this is an astronomically huge number, which means something. 185,000 people, that's the population of Darwin. Dead. Now imagine waking up. The light is dim, there's a light fog. You slept fine, you never heard a thing. It's the smell that wakes you up. something is really wrong. You can barely breathe. And as you walk out of your tent, all around you are the dead for as far as you can see, slumped at campfires, laying on mats in their tents, crumpled to the ground where they had been standing watch, an endless sea of corpses, of the ones who dared compare the one true God with the idols of wicked nations. And these people who dared to mock God are dead. Dead by an astronomical figure. God's response to the humility of a godly king who knelt in the temple and placed the threats against him on the floor. The miracle at the end of 2+ years of faith that demanded near starvation levels of obedience from an entire nation. And God said, this is the faith I demand, and this is the miracle I will provide. There are more well-known miracles. But consider this miracle is recorded 3 times in the Bible. Once in 2 Kings, once in 2 Chronicles, and once here in Isaiah. The scope of this event is epic. This is one of the mightiest acts of God in all of history. Like I said, this event deserves its own movie. God is not weak. He is not slow as we consider slowness. God wins. But going back to those things I asked you to look out for, let's look back at that. God wins. That's the outcome. But what did Hezekiah do? He kept his focus on God. He prayed, but even more, he made God his supreme object of trust. He went to God's house. He presented his needs boldly to God. He listened to Isaiah the messenger that God sent. And no matter how big or small our crisis is, this is our guaranteed best move. Humility always results in grace. And if it worked in this crazy difficult thing for Hezekiah, I'm telling you, this is the right response to every single crisis that comes through our door. And if anything, maybe our danger is underestimating our crisis. It comes in the door and they go, oh, don't worry, God, I can handle this one. And we do that, and it gets deeper and worse and deeper and worse and deeper and worse until eventually we got to go to God anyway. We could have just gone to him in the first place. But we categorize our crises and we try to handle the ones that we can, and then when we finally think it's too big, that's not the way. It's because we come to God in the little ones that we have the courage to come to him with the big ones. This has to be our response. What was God's response? He made promises and kept them. I have preached before about the importance of knowing God's promises. We need to know them because he will keep them. And that becomes a constant. We can depend on God to do what God says he will do. And now the future, we may not know all the details. We may not know all the curves. But I know one thing. God is going to be God, and he is going to do what he does. And he's going to do everything he ever promised to do. And now I have a security and a foundation and a surety that even if today I'm having to almost starve to death in my obedience, yet I know God will keep his promise. He didn't tell them how he was going to keep their promise. There was a lot of less dramatic ways this could have happened. All he said was you'd get to eat. Like there are so many other things that could happen. They could have gotten sick or just decided to go home or decided to go around. You're not worth it. There's so many things that could have happened. No, God tries to do it in a very dramatic way. In the end, the shocking way that this ends simply illustrates without any doubt that God did it. But God could have fulfilled his promise in 100 of different ways. Many of them would have been less obviously him, but that wouldn't have meant that it wasn't him. And that holds true for today. Sometimes God keeps his promises in ways that are extravagant, and sometimes he keeps them in ways that seem very mundane. God isn't worried about style points. He does as he wishes, as it suits his will. Lastly, what does God provide? What was God's timing and provision? And the answer was enough, but not convenient. What God did was dramatic. What God did was obviously him. What God demanded was costly. As I already asked the question, could God have done this right away? Yes. Nobody had to go to bed hungry, but they did for 2.5 years. And nobody had to live under that threat for a whole time, but they did. And we can ask why, and we can guess at the answers, but at the end of the day, we're still only guessing. And look, we would not be the first time. Sometime in our life, if you follow God and you're asked for something and it's not going well, I'm going to tell you, here's the question I have: God, why does it have to be this hard? I've asked this question, so have you. God has his reasons. We don't always, sometimes we never get a good answer. God made his people wait. If you are waiting, I feel for you. If you're in a season of waiting right now and you feel like God's given a promise and you feel like it's out there, but right now God's asking you to wait, I feel for you. I've been there. I know that it's hard. Do not give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. Waiting is sometimes necessary. God is not purposefully cruel. That's not part of his. If it feels like he's being cruel, we just aren't perceiving it correctly. We don't get it. We don't understand. He's not purposefully cruel. And even if we never understand the reason, we must continue to trust that there is one. Maybe in the grand calculus of faith, God is simply winding up to truly amaze us. Maybe that's all it is. I talked at the beginning about the bipolar nature of Isaiah, the prophecies going, but this event is bipolar too. Here comes the enemy and they're massive. It's the biggest threat ever. And then God makes them wait for 2 years and nearly starved to death. And then when God comes through, it's so dramatically powerful. It is a swing from the left to the absolute right. It is the way things often are with God. And it isn't easy, and it wears us out. And yet, the reality is, sin is hard. The consequences of evil are bad. And the provision of God is extravagant. And it's amazing. So let's cling to the promise of what has been extravagantly set aside for us. Let's pray.
You've been listening to Oasis by the Sea. Thank you for joining us. May God richly bless you as you walk in obedience to him this week. See you next week at the Oasis.